one of the most frequent conversations I have with customers is, how do I choose what platforms I should leverage in Azure, right? Which is really kind of a, how do I build my application and what are my choices when I go to build my application? And there's lots of different ways to look at this, but what I like to do for kind of a phase one, a level one sort of evaluation of the different choices that you have is to think about a continuum where on the left-hand side, I have what I refer to as self-managed environments, right? Where what I'm really doing is deploying an application environment where all of the management more or less still is in my hands. And with great responsibility comes great power. So while you may be responsible for a lot of things, you also get a ton of flexibility and able to do more things. Whereas as I move to the right of the continuum, a lot of the management and administrative and operational tasks are taken off of my plate. But in exchange for that, I give up some of the flexibility and some of the options that I may have had if I were managing those things myself. So if we start on the left-hand side, the easiest and most obvious example of what would be self-managed in the Azure environment is this idea of virtual machines, right? The idea that I'm going to take either existing virtual machines or build new ones, provision those into Azure, and put my application on those virtual machines. And so I have to do things like create the virtual machine and put my app onto the virtual machine and then create all the networking and configure the scale sets. And then I'm worrying about updating the operating system and patching it and doing all these types of things. Now, again, I can do whatever I want with that virtual machine and configure my app however I want it to and give it whatever access it needs to the underlying operating system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of responsibility there. So this is the classic sort of lift and shift approach to the cloud, your mess for less, very well understood right at this point. As I move toward the right now, I start to run into new options. And in the middle here, and you can kind of argue where it would fall exactly, but there's two very similar pieces of technology that I kind of put in the middle. And that would be Azure Kubernetes Service. So it's the Azure running Kubernetes for you in the cloud and taking over a lot of the cluster configuration pieces and underlying cluster management for you. And then there is also Azure Service Fabric, right, which is similar yet different from what we do with Kubernetes, and that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. But more or less, these are application orchestrators. They provide me a lot of benefit, right? So these automatically, deploy my application across the nodes and balance those and give me networking inside of the cluster and ways to expose my application's service endpoints publicly and all these other types of things that would have been very, very hard for me to do if I was just kind of creating all of this from scratch with virtual machines. Now, I do give up some things. I don't have carte blanche to do whatever I want to do in these environments, but I still have quite a bit of flexibility in exchange for having to understand how do I configure and manage the AKS environment or the Service Fabric environment, and what are the knobs and dials that I have to turn to really make this platform as effective for my applications as I could. Again, gives you lots of flexibility, but it also increases kind of your management overhead. Continuing along toward the right-hand side, the next platform that we run into is the App Services platform, right? So here we have an environment where I can deploy, and we'll just kind of focus on the big two. I can deploy web apps or API apps, right? So I can go out there and have my website running. I can put my APIs out there, and I still have some knobs and dials, right? I can just say how big, how many nodes, right, do I want to have running my web API, or what are some settings that I want to have, and how, those types of things. But really underneath the covers, Microsoft is managing that platform for you. And because of that, there's certain constraints on what your application can do with regards to interacting with the underlying operating system, all these types of things, right? So lots of simplicity from an operational perspective, not as much flexibility from a development perspective is sort of the way to think about that. And then we get to the kind of holy grail of the fully managed environment, which would be something like Azure Functions, right? Which is a serverless technology. The underlying platform, for all intents and purposes, is highly abstracted. You give us your code and we run it and take care of all the scaling and failover and all those types of things underneath the covers for you. and you get all the benefits. That is the high level continuum. Now there's some things going on now, right, that start to muddy these waters a little bit, and so I'll just reference one of them in particular, which is this idea of service fabric mesh, right? So service fabric mesh is service fabric, but with a very serverless feel. So where you want to put it, on this continuum here, right, probably is open to debate, and how far over do you push it, because it's not quite like functions. There's still some things I have to kind of be aware of and manage in a little more detail. It might not have quite the same things as service or as app services. But it's this idea of trying to take this orchestration sorts of capabilities and make them much, much more fully managed, much, much more serverless, as it were. And kind of floating around in here somewhere also is things like, Azure container instances, right? How do those play into this environment? And we'll set those aside for right now. Most customers, right, are going to start here, in my experience, is that it's the most easily understood environment, has the smallest learning curve for most organizations, supports a variety of application types and platforms, and gives me a whole bunch of benefit that for a large percentage of applications is more than enough, right? Not every application needs Netflix or scalability, right? And so app services tends to be where most customers will start. And then the question becomes, well, as my application grows, my application portfolio grows, I start to build more true microservices, how do I prepare myself to maybe possibly move this way? It's kind of easy to understand how I move to the right to a degree, right? I'm just kind of taking my code and breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. Again, a bit of an overstatement there, but good enough for now. But the real question becomes, well, what does this mean for me going the other way? Or if I'm in the VM world today, right? If a customer is starting here because they're doing a lift and shift exercise, how do they prepare themselves to start to move somewhere to the right, either stopping in kind of an orchestrator environment or maybe making the jump all the way over to app services? And this is where Docker really starts to come into play. Now, those of you who are big AKS people, and to a lesser degree the service fabric folks, are like, well, of course, Docker, that's what we use as our deployment technology. But in this context, the way to think of Docker really is that Docker is, for all intents and purposes, equivalent to your deployment artifact, right? So this is really the way that I'm going to package my application for deployment across really this range of offerings, from self-managed to more or less fully managed, right? So I could be deploying, if I wanted to, I could be deploying my Docker container into my virtual machines as the way that I get my application into that environment. Then as I need to or I gain more experience, I may start to use that same artifact model, maybe even the same application, depending on what you're doing and how it's designed, to target one of these other environments, right? So I have choices using Docker. I won't go into all the ins and outs of how you do, Docker in Azure with Azure Container Registry and VSTS and all those types of things. But again, the way to look at it is Docker enables me to choose from a variety of platforms based on either my maturity as a cloud development organization, a DevOps organization, or from a needs perspective based on application requirements. So that's the high level sort of framework that I will set the table with customers. And then what we will do is just start to evaluate, well, what are your particular application requirements? What are your particular development and IT ops skill sets? And that will help steer us towards which of these environments makes the most sense. Sometimes it's a mix. It all really depends. But just it's a common conversation I have. Thought I would share it with folks just so that they could maybe glean a few nuggets from that. So hopefully this was useful, and until next time.